Eventually, Pharaoh let the Jews go, as documented in the book of Exodus, but after the dramatic and miraculous escape into the wilderness, they lost faith in the God who had liberated them, and after just 2 months in the wilderness, they were drawn back to the worship of false gods in the desert, the same gods that they'd been surrounded with all their lives in Egypt. While Moses was at the top of Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments from God, the people at the foot of the mountain began to wonder if he was ever coming down again. They lost faith and demanded that new gods be made to show them the way. They built a golden calf and claimed that this was the God that had led them out of slavery. Now, why a golden calf? Well, remember that Nimrod was represented by a bull and had a crown of bull horns because the Chaldean word for ruler also meant bull. Thus a bull was chosen to symbolize Nimrod in his worship, and gold was chosen because gold was a depiction of the color of the sun. Incidentally, have you ever wondered why Satan is often depicted with bull horns coming out of his head? And have you ever wondered why Hindus regard bulls as sacred? It seems random, doesn't it? But now you know. Look for the threads, connect the dots, and you'll always end up back at Babylon. With your understanding of Babylon from the series so far, you should begin to see connections you hadn't seen before. Following after the abominable patterns of worship set by Nimrod and Semiramis, which included sexual rituals and fornication, Moses returned from the mountain to find the Israelites defiling themselves by reveling in this kind of behavior. They defiled themselves in every sense by worshipping this satanic god, allowing idols into their camp, and in the depraved acts they perpetrated in his name. Now we have already seen examples of the cancerous spread of wickedness in the world, and the same was threatening to happen amongst God's chosen people here. Moses had to take swift action to purge the camp. A little yeast is quick to infect the whole batch, and the Jews simply had to be kept holy. They were absolutely vital to God's master plan of salvation for the world. If they too were lost to paganism, there was no hope for mankind. The whole world would be doomed to hellish misery and destruction. If the Jews did not survive as a righteous people devoted to God, then there would be no people group through whom Jesus could be born. The Messiah, who was destined to die on a cross for the sins of the world, overcoming death and Satan in the process, to free mankind from the yoke of slavery it was currently under, could not come. The Bible that tells us about those events would never have been written, meaning we would be without hope. The very existence of hope, life and liberty hinged on what happened to the Jews. It was that important. Moses made a tough decision. He asked all those who were on the Lord's side to come to him. They were then told to strap on their swords and kill those who weren't. Around 3,000 died that day. This incident is used by modern atheists to portray God as a bloodthirsty monster, unworthy of worship. But if those 3,000 hadn't died, and the Jews had turned to paganism and Jesus hadn't come, I doubt if there would even be a world today. And if there was, it would be hell on earth. Satan would be running amok, and there would be nothing but wickedness, depravity, pain, and misery. We only have to look in further detail at some of the practices
Yeah, literally,
associated
I'll
with
just go
the
back to
ancient
fucking
gods
Moloch.
to get an idea.
Molech, whatever he pronounces.
For example, take Molech, who is the form of
Molech.
Marduk or Nimrod worshipped by the Ammonites. We read in Leviticus that part of their rituals involved child sacrifice and cannibalism. God warned Moses about this repeatedly. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed, to be passed through the fire to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Human sacrifices and fire were part of Nimrod's worship from the very earliest days, of course, because fire was seen to be the earthly representation of the sun. Later, in Jeremiah 32:35, we read, They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters, causing them to pass through fire to Molech, though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin. In the same way God's priests in the tabernacle used the meat of the animal sacrifices for food, so the priests of Baal did also eat of their human sacrifices. In fact, this is where we get the word cannibal from. The Chaldean Canna-Baal means priest of Baal. Don't let anyone attempt to portray God as a murderous villain, slaughtering innocent women and children. We are talking about the defeat of depravity from the pit of hell. People who sacrificed their own children and ate their flesh. The camp had to be kept holy, a concept our world understands little about. We should also see in this episode the burning hatred God has for sin, and remember how vital it is for us to remain righteous in His sight today. Because of Jesus, there is now no need for bloodshed when we sin, and this has perhaps diminished our understanding of its severity. We should remember, however, that the punishment for sin is as severe today as it always has been. It's just that Jesus already spilled His blood so that we don't have to. When we sin, we deserve death just as much as those Israelites who turned away from God. Thank Jesus He has taken the punishment on our behalf. Perhaps as further punishment for that generation, perhaps to build character, perhaps to continue the purging process, and perhaps because we develop a deeper relationship with God in times of trial, almost certainly a mixture of all four of these, God decided to keep them in the desert for 40 more years. God needed to get these people to trust Him and to build a relationship with Him, and the wilderness, a place where they had to rely on Him even for food and water, served that purpose. One final thing I'd like to highlight about the desert years. Notice how God chose to reveal Himself to Moses. He chose to reveal Himself at the top of Mount Sinai, a mountain. Remember that Babylonian ziggurats were built to represent mountains, and the apexes were said to be where the gods lived. Remember, this is as a result of Satan's desire to be the Most High. Because all ancient mythologies and false religions stem from Babylon, you'll find parallels of this in many cultures. Mount Olympus, for example, is famously where the Greek gods were supposed to have lived. The fact that God revealed Himself to Moses at the top of a mountain clearly echoes this idea. It is likely God did this so the Israelites could understand what was going on when Moses ascended Sinai. They were used to the idea that deities lived at the top of mountains. This appears to be God using what they already knew to communicate that He was their God, talking to them in a symbolic language they could understand. And since ziggurats were built by man to glorify man, and their gods were said to reside there, God was showing His superiority again by revealing Himself atop a mountain that He'd made, a real one, and on ground that was so much higher than any ziggurat. What God was saying to His people is that He was the real Most High. Just to connect some more dots with this, remember that Jesus' most famous sermon is the Sermon on the Mount. This wasn't an accident. By choosing that location, He was subtly revealing Himself in the symbolic language to be God. You see, the Bible starts to reveal extra layers when you understand the nature of the battle. When the Israelites eventually did reach the Promised Land, the first thing they were commanded by God to do was to destroy all the altars and images that had been set up there by pagan tribes to honor Baal and Asherah. Once more we see an assistance from God that their camp is kept clean. Holiness is paramount. The fate of the world is resting on these people. Instead of doing so, they ended up turning their back on God and worshipping the idols again. The lure of the gods that surround them and the culture in which they have been steeped keeps polluting and sidetracking God's people, and God is constantly disciplining them and drawing them back into Him. The battle between God and Satan for this people group manifests itself as a tug of war, where the Israelites are constantly rebelling and being restored. The determination of Satan to destroy the relationship the Jews have with God throughout the Bible is very clear. They were, after all, fast becoming the last barrier between him and total domination. He wasn't about to leave them alone. And at this point I want to introduce you to an absolutely vital point which will develop in the following parts. I call it Satan's Plan A and Plan B, and it crops up constantly, so we really need to get a hold of it. What Satan wants above everything else is domination or control. Now there are two ways to achieve this. One way is considered the feminine way, which is employed in a position of weakness. It's called manipulation. If women are to attempt to control their husbands or anyone else, this is generally how they do it, through tears, hurt feelings, emotional blackmail, etc. The second way of achieving domination is considered the masculine way, and it's employed when in a position of strength, and it's through violence or intimidation. This is generally how men control people, by threatening them with their strength. So there's a feminine way associated with the moon goddess or Asherah, which I refer to as Plan A, and a masculine way associated with the sun god or Baal that I refer to as Plan B. But both techniques are aiming for the same satanic end, which is control or domination. Now, up until this stage of human history, Satan had always managed to get his way with Plan A, subtle manipulation. He appealed to the pride of the angels, and a third followed him. He appealed to the pride of Adam and Eve, and the same thing happened. After the flood, he managed to influence Nimrod and Semiramis, and satanic polytheism began filling the earth. He must have felt pretty pleased with himself, because in the time period between Adam and Moses, human beings had actually been very easy pickings for him. He'd been able to sway pretty much whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without much resistance at all. He never had to go to war against humans in an overt sense. He'd merely appealed to their vanity and offered them the world. In the face of that offer, they had buckled every time. Some more examples of this. When the Muslim prophet Muhammad first established Islam, his initial approach to the Jews was the same. Muhammad tried to be subtle about introducing his false religion into their midst. He claimed he served the same God as them and was a prophet. This was Plan A. When the Jews rejected his claims, he turned violent against them and was hell-bent on their destruction for the rest of his days, and this was Plan B. When Jesus was in the wilderness prior to the commencement of his ministry, Satan tempted him with Plan A. He promised him land, wealth, and status. When Jesus turned him down, Satan saw to it that he was crucified. This was Plan B. When Edmund finds himself in Narnia in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, the White Witch is charming and polite, offering him Turkish delight and hot chocolate. This is Plan A. When Edmund comes to his senses, she goes after him, demanding his life, and she would have had it too if Aslan had not ransomed it. This was Plan B. Plan A is manipulation, and Plan B is intimidation. These are the two ways for Satan to reach the same target, domination. He wants to dominate the earth. Now, up until this stage, Satan had gone with Plan A as far as the Jews were concerned. He thought they could be swayed and tempted to follow him like the rest of the world if he pitched it just right. He was wrong. It had won him some battles, but it just wasn't winning him the war. God was determined enough to keep restoring them to him, to keep drawing them back into him, and to keep forgiving them, no matter how many times they strayed. And so Satan has regularly switched to Plan B. Across the world and throughout history, the Jews have frequently been threatened with extermination, enslavement, and persecution. Hatred of the Jews in nations, organizations, and individuals is often a telltale sign of Satan's influence behind the scenes. Immediately after Israel was established in the promised land of Canaan, it was governed by a system of judges, and God was considered to be their supreme ruler or king. But by the time of 1 Samuel, the people started to demand a human king in order to be like the other nations around them. In spite of God's warnings about this, they persisted with the request, and God obliged. The first human king was Saul, who was soon replaced by David, and this takes us into the book of 1 Kings in the Bible, where the subsequent succession of kings are documented. These transitions of leadership led to a downward spiral and the eventual division of Israel, and throughout it all we see a constant invasion of Baal worship over the years. Satan was still going with Plan A at this point. The pivotal figure was King Ahab, and just as Nimrod's importance was hinted at by the extra attention given to him in Genesis, the same can be said of King Ahab in the book of 1 Kings. The writer makes sure to elaborate on his reign and to tell us his story in greater depth than the other kings. The Bible says of Ahab that he did evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. This guy was the worst of the worst. There had been bad kings before, but no one touched Ahab. Not only this, but he married a woman called Jezebel, who was the princess daughter of Ethbaal, Canaanite king of Tyre and Sidon, and priest of Astarte. You couldn't get a worse combination of titles, and clearly this was not the kind of family the king of Israel should have been marrying into. For a people that God was intent on keeping undefiled and pure, this marriage would pose significant problems. As expected, soon after their marriage, the pollution began. Ahab established a temple for Baal and an Asherah pole in Israel for his wife's sake. An Asherah pole is basically an obscene phallic symbol, otherwise known as an obelisk. But Queen Jezebel was not content to simply allow the worship of Baal and Asherah concurrently with the worship of Israel's true God. She was determined to eliminate worship of the true God altogether. She embarked on a campaign whereby most of God's prophets were killed, and in their place were installed false prophets for Baal and Asherah. She successfully controlled Ahab, implemented idol worship, and had him build a temple in their honor. As a result, the biblical record shows Israel plunging from the heights of David's glorious and godly reign to the depths of the pagan idolatry and Satanism under Ahab, and this was in many ways Israel's darkest hour. Satan was very close to winning God's chosen people to himself, once and for all. The apostasy of Israel was almost complete. The foundations of godliness were fast crumbling. The judgment of God was forthcoming. Now, do Ahab and Jezebel remind you of anyone? They were virtually identical to Nimrod and Semiramis. It's almost as though Satan thought to himself that since this tactic had worked so well in Babylon, it might just be the one that would finally clinch victory in the battle to subvert the Israelites. Like when a play or shot works particularly well in sports, you're tempted to use it again in the hope it produces the same result. This is what he was doing. He was attempting to create the same kind of structure within Israel that he had created in Babylon, and was hoping the same end would be achieved. Just as Semiramis had risen to power on the coattails of Nimrod, the evil Jezebel wed herself to Ahab and introduced idolatry into their life as an evil religious practice. This was probably not a marriage of love. Rather, it was a spiritual and political affiliation designed to merge two different kingdoms. Just as Semiramis had an insatiable lust for power and would go to any ends to retain it, even killing her husband and plotting to kill her son, we see the same kind of spirit in Jezebel, a lust for power, control, and domination. Given her background in Baal worship where sex acts and licentious living was exalted as a way to tap into the power of the gods, she would have had no qualms about sleeping her way to the top. Ahab, king of Israel, was completely subdued and dominated by Jezebel. Israel was now full of pagan shrines, filled with priestess prostitutes, servicing the worshippers. The sexual lure was more than the men of Israel could resist. By Jezebel's influence, 10 million Israelites left the worship of God for Baal and Ashtoreth. Only 7,000 people in the entire nation were not swayed by her control. This is how close Satan came to claiming Israel and thus removing the last remaining barrier between him and world domination. God, however, as always, had a man for the job, Elijah. Jezebel had killed most of God's prophets but hadn't managed to get her hands on Elijah yet, and it was he who God used to turn Israel back from the brink. It all took place on Mount Carmel, a direct showdown between God and Baal. Elijah was becoming exasperated with the disobedience of the Jews and their constant wandering away from God. The nation that God had reserved for himself by covenant kept prostituting itself with the evil Babylonian system, and so he challenged the priests of Baal to go to Mount Carmel for a contest in front of all Israel. Notice again how he chooses a mountain for this confrontation. They are competing to find out who is the commander of the high places and the real Most High God. The confrontation is designed to show God's people once and for all that they should turn their back on Baal, who is Satan, and commit themselves to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people were completely silent. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish, and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call in the name of your God, and I will call in the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God." And all the people agreed. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls, and prepare it, and call in the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood." So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called in the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us!" But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming, or is relieving himself. Or maybe he is away on a trip, or is asleep and needs to be wakened." So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, no response. Then Elijah called to the people, "Come over here." They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour the water over the offering and the wood." After they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again." And when they were finished, he said, "Now do it a 3rd time." So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so that these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, He is God. Yes, the Lord is God." Then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there. Notice that self-mutilation was a part of the normal custom for Baal worship, and remember that Satan loves to humiliate and mutilate man because he is made in God's image. One of the evidences of the increasing influence of paganism on society today as we hurtle towards the New World Order, the Antichrist, and the end times is the rise in self-harm, tattooing, and unusual piercings. Particularly tattoos have become socially acceptable, and Christians have fallen prey to this pollution. Here are some quotations from various
I don't even
experts
have any
regarding the
tattoos.
practice.
Yet the worship of the sun god all had involved the marking of the hands with the divine token and mystic attempt to acquire strength. Well, shit. Historically, tattooing.
Like Babylon, Jezebel is intriguingly mentioned in Revelation. So like Babylon, this means there's a Jezebel spirit that hasn't ever gone away, and won't go away until God deals with it directly at the end of time. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. By her teaching she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely, unless they repent of her ways. I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. Now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching, and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets. Notice that phrase at the end. God refers to Satan's deep secrets. This is a direct reference to the secret serpent knowledge from Eden that forms the basis of the mysteries that occultists are so anxious to know. Now obviously the literal person of Jezebel is not going to be present in Thyatira, as she died thousands of years ago in 2 Kings in the Bible. The reference is a prophetic parallel. Just as John the Baptist was Elijah because he came in the spirit and power of Elijah, this person or influence in Thyatira will be under the spiritual control of the same demonic influences that controlled Jezebel. Thus there is a type of demonic influence in society today and the church, because this passage in Revelation 2 was written to the church, that can rightly be called by the name Jezebel. This demonic spirit existed long before Queen Jezebel, and indeed goes back to Semiramis, but Jezebel was so totally controlled by its nature that she has become its namesake. We also know far more about the characteristics of the spirit through Jezebel than Semiramis, because her story is recorded in 2 Kings. But whatever is true of the nature of Jezebel was true of the nature of Semiramis, because they were both controlled by the same spirit. The spirit of Semiramis is the spirit of Jezebel, which is the spirit of Astarte or Ashtoreth or Asherah, which is the spirit of witchcraft. In Scripture, Herodias is also a type of this force. As Jezebel opposed Elijah, so Herodias opposed John the Baptist. So what about this Jezebel spirit? A Jezebel spirit above all seeks domination, and to achieve this end she uses manipulation and intimidation. Now although Jezebel is commonly referred to as a she, as a spirit she can exhibit behaviors that are associated with both males and females. For example, people who recognize they are weaker than those they seek to control tend to use manipulation. This is normally true of females who may use tears, hurt feelings, and emotional guilt to get what they want. People who feel stronger than those they want to control tend to intimidate. This is more characteristic of men, who may use strength, violence, or other forms of intimidation to control others for their own ends. Different methods, but the same goal: domination. This is the definition of witchcraft. The Jezebel spirit will use manipulation while she feels she's in a position of weakness, but once she has acquired the power, will switch to intimidation. We can see this in the way she threatened to murder Elijah, and I keep referring back to our Plan A and Plan B concept. Plan A is the female, manipulative way to dominate, and Plan B is the masculine, violent, and intimidating way to dominate. Interestingly, the female method is far more socially acceptable in modern society. I once heard a girl boasting that she could get guys to do anything she wanted. All she had to do was lure them with her beauty, which is the essence of femininity, and she had them in the palm of her hand. What she didn't realize is that the guy could equally use his superior physical strength, which is the essence of masculinity, to force her to do what he wanted, but he didn't. So if the guy didn't dominate her with his strength, perhaps she shouldn't dominate him with her beauty. But the subtle feminine method of control is considered almost normal in society, and so it goes on all the time unchallenged. Overt intimidation and violence, on the other hand, will put the perpetrator in jail.
Not that fucking picture.
Spiritually, Christians should view both forms as equally offensive. Both are aiming for domination and control over another person, which is witchcraft. Now referring back to the Jonathan Livingston seagull example, where the demons behaved like seagulls as they were being expelled and had taken on the characteristics of the thing from where they had originated, we can conclude that since the Jezebel spirit originated with Semiramis, it would follow that it has her characteristics. This spirit therefore seems more comfortable operating through women and initially tends to establish control without the use of actual physical force. She is more easily associated with classic feminine persuasion techniques, and the Bible always refers to her as a woman. You will often find the Jezebel spirit trying to get close to those who already have control. Proverbs says, "Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. Her house is the way to hell, descending to the chambers of death." Scripture emphasizes that the intended target of the spirit is strong men. It primarily targets men with leadership skills or powerful positions such as Nimrod and Ahab. But in reality she has a deep hatred of true spiritual authority and will always seek to replace it with illegitimate authority. She will do this through emotional pressure, witchcraft, and obsessive sensuality. But make no mistake, lust and sex are merely tools to weaken others in order for her to accomplish her goal. The subtle persuasions of femininity are used only to gain influence and to get close to those in control. She then uses this position to gradually dominate. In the Hebrew, the name Jezebel means literally, without cohabitation. She will not live with those she cannot dominate and control. She will have no equals. We saw evidence of this when Semiramis ordered the death of Nimrod and plotted to do the same to Tammuz. There are no ends she will not go to in order to gain and keep control. It is what Jezebel wants more than anything. Domination is always satanic and stands in contrast to the example given to us by Jesus, the servant king, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Even when Jezebel appears to be submissive, it is usually out of carefully wrought plan to gain influence. In 1 Kings 21:8 we read, "Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name, and sealed them with his seal, and sent them to the elders and nobles of the city." This tells us that she prefers to remain concealed in the background while she manipulates situations and leaders, a hidden hand behind the public figure, just like Satan is the king of Tyre, pulling the strings behind the prince of Tyre. The power of the spirit of Jezebel should not be underestimated. For 7 years God had carefully and miraculously protected Elijah from Ahab's armies. God had even commanded ravens to feed him in the wilderness. He had supernaturally met all his needs. In the Mount Carmel showdown, Elijah called down fire from heaven and resoundingly defeated and killed the priests of Baal. All Israel fell at his feet in repentance, worshipping the true God. Elijah was one of the mightiest prophets of God that the world had ever seen. He was vindicated and victorious. And yet it took a single threat from Jezebel to send Elijah spinning into anxiety and even depression. He fled to the desert and begged God to kill him. Think about this, because naturally speaking it makes no sense. Elijah enjoyed supernatural protection for 7 years, watched fire fall from heaven, saw his enemies defeated, and still Jezebel could bring him to this condition with a single threat. This is an example of Jezebel's power to intimidate and strike fear into the hearts of men, causing them to withdraw. Jezebel will try to steal your vision. Jezebel will even make you depressed and anxious when there is nothing significantly different in your circumstances. And if there are difficult circumstances, this spirit will tell you that they are insurmountable, impossible, and overwhelming. Jezebel will make you feel like dying when in reality you are God's man of the hour. Spiritual life may seem irrelevant and pointless. You may lose the desire to pray and the faith to try. Demonic voices will tell you it's all hopeless. You may suddenly find yourself in unreasonable anxiety, fearing tragedy or death, pessimistic and cynical. Much of what is called depression is actually Jezebel. Jezebel wants to paralyze with fear, condemnation, depression, apathy, or whatever it takes until we withdraw. The only answer for those under Jezebel's attack is perseverance in battle. And remember, the God who resoundingly defeated Baal on Carmel can do the same today. followed the mystery religion from Babylon through Egypt and seen the struggle between good and evil as it threatened to contaminate God's chosen people in Israel. We've seen how God kept showing the Israelites that he was their God and to stay with him, and how he even went as far as to defeat Baal in a direct confrontation to prove his point in front of the whole nation. The Jews, however, just couldn't seem to stay on course for very long, and they kept sliding away into paganism. Satan had had enough of Plan A tactics by this point, and he instead switched to Plan B. Babylon invaded the nation of Israel, laid siege to Jerusalem, sacked the city, and destroyed the temple. God let this happen as a means of disciplining his people, and had even forewarned the Jews that it would happen through the prophet Jeremiah. Even when Satan appears to be winning, God is always in control. This period of Babylonian history is known as the Neo-Babylonian period, and it was the one that largely belonged to King Nebuchadnezzar II. Around 610 BC, Nebuchadnezzar was a ranking staff officer within the Babylonian army who oversaw the restoration of the Temple of Marduk, king of gods, in the Babylonian pantheon. He then rose to power around 604 BC and set about expanding the empire by conquest. He embarked on a number of campaigns to subdue and conquer surrounding nations, and it was in 590 BC that he attacked Jerusalem. From this victory, he took around 10,000 captives back with him to Babylon, but these were only those that were considered useful. He took the young men, the princes, the best soldiers, the craftsmen, and the smiths. The rest were left behind. Perhaps the most famous of these young men taken to Babylon were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were to go through 3 years of training in an education program that would indoctrinate them with Babylonian ideas to make them useful to the empire. To help assimilate them into their new culture and to help swerve their allegiance away from God to the Babylonian gods, they were all given new names. The name Daniel, which means God is my judge, became Belshazzar, which means Bel or Baal, protect his life. Hananiah, which means the Lord shows grace, became Shadrach, which means under the command of Aku. Mishael, which means who is like God, became Meshach, which means who is like Aku. And Azariah, which means the Lord helps, became Abednego, which means servant of Nego, who is God of learning. It was also upon Nebuchadnezzar's return to Babylon at the end of these campaigns that he built this monument, called the Ishtar Gate. It was at the entrance to his great city, and is the name by which Astarte or Asherah had come to be known in Babylon at the time. On it were 337 images of dragons. 337 in pagan numerology represents hell, so this gate to Babylon is literally meant to be, in a sense, the gate to hell. Remember this monument because it still exists in a museum in Berlin, Germany, and we'll be discussing it when we get around to the 20th century. Now, as Daniel records in his book of the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar attempted to force Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to worship his Babylonian gods. The 3 young men at this point give one of the most stirring speeches in the Bible, and one which conveys the exact same attitude of defiance that we need to foster today. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." When they refused, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. Again we see the recurring theme of fire as the preferred form of sacrifice to Baal, because he was the sun god. However, while in the furnace, they are met by someone who is generally accepted to be a pre-incarnate Jesus, and they come out unharmed. Therefore, once again, God shows his power over satanic idols, and this had the ironic effect of making a believer out of Nebuchadnezzar, Whoever would have thought that there would be a day when a Babylonian king would worship God? The key event for us, however, as we continue our journey through this time, is Nebuchadnezzar's prophetic dream and Daniel's interpretation of it in chapter 2. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell them what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Daniel 2, 1-3. This dream of Nebuchadnezzar's came before his conversion, and as was the norm for a pagan king, he was surrounded by the usual array of astrologers and sorcerers connected with the mysteries, those who would seek to draw their supernatural powers of interpretation from Satan. They couldn't decipher the dream. Daniel, however, could. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to the things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation, and that you may understand what went through your mind. Notice first of all that Daniel establishes that God is the real source of wisdom and revealer of mysteries and hidden things. Satan claims to have this secret knowledge that he disseminates through his mystery religion, but actually, God is the omniscient one. Notice how Daniel also emphasizes that he does not know the interpretation because he has more knowledge than others. He makes it clear that he is simply relying on God. We should start noticing how much of the Old Testament tells of a constant battle between two kingdoms. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue is made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its bellies and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united, any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. So the dream was a prophetic one that explained, in the form of a statue, how the Babylonian kingdom would have 3 successors that would follow after it. The statue, of course, was human to represent the fact that these kingdoms were made by man for man's glory, as Babylon originally had been. The first kingdom, symbolized by the head of gold, was the Babylonian Empire itself. Daniel then states that the head of gold empire would be followed by an inferior empire, symbolized by arms of silver. Christian scholars generally regard this to be the Medo-Persian Empire, which in 539 BC conquered the Babylonian Empire. The two arms symbolically refer to the two groups, the Medes and the Persians. The third kingdom was symbolized by the statue's belly and thighs of brass. Scholars believe this is a reference to the Grecian Empire, which conquered and then came after the Medo-Persian Empire. The symbol of a belly and thighs of brass suggests that the kingdom was to start out as a united empire but end up as a divided empire. Under the leadership of Alexander the Great, the Grecian Empire was indeed a united empire, but after Alexander's death, the empire was divided up. It was around this time, when Greece was the dominant power, that the Mystery Babylon religion became known as Gnosticism. The word gnosis in Greek means knowledge. Gnostics still believed that humans were divine souls stuck within imperfect human bodies created by an imperfect God. They still believed there was a second and superior God who provided them with the esoteric knowledge necessary to become gods themselves. Ashtoreth had taken on the name Sophia because Sophia means wisdom in Greek. The serpent was portrayed as the good father of Cain. Yahweh was portrayed as an unreasonable God who had cursed Adam and Eve wrongly after a temper tantrum. High priestesses were ordained through sexual rituals. There were still blood oaths, secret handshakes, signal symbols, passwords, and fornication as part of worship. In other words, except for a few name changes, the Babylonian religion had survived in its entirety throughout the empire changes. It is from this era that we get the word agnostic. Because those who believed and practiced this religion were called Gnostics, those who did not believe it were considered agnostics. Today the word agnostic is used to refer to someone who says they are unsure or ignorant regarding the existence of God because of a lack of information. Anciently, however, the word agnostic would have identified a person who deliberately desired to remain ignorant of the secret knowledge and rituals through which the Gnostic good God, the serpent, and the mystery religion of Babel might be revealed. The name Gnosticism was used for the mysteries right up until the time of Jesus and for some period afterwards. Some Gnostics in fact saw in Jesus a similarity between him and their pagan serpent, as they believed he was dispensing knowledge of the kingdom of God. Consequently, two Gnostic Christian sects called the Nassenes, so called because in Hebrew Nahas means snake, and Ophites, so called because in Greek Ophis means snake, worshipped the serpent in the alleged identity of Jesus Messiah. They stole the symbol of the cross and entwined the serpent around it. You may see the symbol interpreted as Christ crucifying the serpent to the cross wherever it is seen, especially in Catholic graveyards, but its true blasphemous meaning comes from a Gnostic corruption of Christianity. Gnosticism in Greece also heavily influenced the ancient philosophers such as Socrates and Aristotle, who lived around this time. Their ideas were then passed to Plato, and these three are still revered as the fathers of philosophy. Plato is of particular significance for the New World Order, as we'll discover later. Their so-called wise words are still taught to philosophy students around the world, but much of their ideas are simply ancient Babylonian lies. While the mysteries had become known as Gnosticism in Greece, the Jews had come to know it as Kabbalah by this point, which means hidden secrets. It was also known as the Oral Secret Law. Kabbalah developed mainly through a man called Philo, who adapted or inverted many parts of the Old Testament to fit with Babylonian mysticism. Kabbalah gained a fair amount of popularity in the 200 years prior to Jesus. Today Kabbalah has made something of a resurgence, particularly amongst the rich and famous. It's just the Babylonian mysteries by another name. So to recap, the first kingdom in Nebuchadnezzar's dream was Babylon, the second was Medo-Persia, and the third was Greece. What was the fourth? The fourth symbol, as seen in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and interpreted by Daniel, that of iron legs and feet that were part iron and part clay, represents the mighty Roman Empire, which conquered the Grecian Empire. The Roman Empire has shaped the history of Europe and the world ever since. Two final things to say about the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Firstly, notice how the value of the metals degrades over time. We start off with gold representing Babylon and end with iron and clay representing Rome. This represents the fact that man-made kingdoms are deteriorating over time. The second point about the statue is that although the value of the metals decreases over time, their strength increases until it becomes iron. This means that as we degenerate in morality, we increase in force, and adopt the mentality put forward by Friedrich Nietzsche, that might makes right.